They were called orphan trains. Can you imagine thousands and thousands of American children being shipped across the country to be delivered to families waiting for them? That's exactly what happened between 1854 and 1929. They were called orphan trains. The New York Foundling Society sent more than 200,000 children across the country on trains. Waiting in small villages and in farming communities were families who hoped to adopt them. At each stop, the children would be herded off the train, and there the families would look and select and choose a child to take home with them. I'd like to think that some of those stories were love stories, that parents found the desires of their hearts and children found a loving place to belong. But I also wonder if in some cases those children were no more than glorified servants working long hours on a forgotten farm in the upper Midwest. Well, orphans and their stories loom large in the literature of the English language. There is Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, the story of Pip. An unknown benefactor turns Pip into a gentleman. And then where would J.K. Rowling be without that orphan named Harry Potter, who lives under the stairs in the very non-magical Dursley family? And Walt Disney, from Bambi to Cinderella to The Lion King, all of those stories are predicated on the loss of one or both parents growing up as an orphan. I remember some years ago reading a book between parent and child, written by an educator named Haim Janat. Andy is a young boy talking with his father, and one night he asked his dad, "What's the number of abandoned children in Harlem?" Now his father is an intellectual, and he puts his paper aside and gives his son a very well thought out and defined answer. But that doesn't satisfy the boy. What's the number of abandoned children in New York City? What's the number of orphans in America, in the United States, in the world? And finally, the boy's father realizes he doesn't want a statistical answer. He's asking from the heart. He's afraid of being abandoned himself, and thus the reason for his questions. We all have that fear of abandonment, of being orphaned, of being alone. This seems to be a very lonely time for many of us. The United Nations Council on the Education of Children says there are more than 153 million orphans in the world. But we can feel that way as well, can't we? In John's Gospel, there's a place where Jesus is getting ready to leave his disciples. And in the 14th chapter, he tells them, "I'm leaving, but I'm not going to leave you orphaned. I will not leave you alone." I can't tell you how many times over the years as a pastor, people in their 40s and 50s and even 60s, when having lost their last surviving parent, have said to me, "Now I'm really an orphan in the world, aren't I?" That fear of being alone, of being abandoned, of being disconnected from one another is the root of much of our anxiety. Isn't it true that, as Rolling Stone magazine wrote many years ago, at least a quarter of us, 25% of Americans, have that pervading sense of loneliness? And again, these last 2 months, for many of us, have been very lonely times. But Jesus says, "I will not leave you like an orphan. I won't leave you alone." Years ago, I was in a theology class in a university in Indiana. The teacher was a Kansas farmer named Wayne Caldwell. He was legally blind, a man with a good sense of humor, and he tried one warm spring afternoon to convey the theological sense of the concept of adoption in Christian theology Well, theology really doesn't carry the bag sometimes. So he set his notes aside and he said, let me tell you a story. Wayne was born in a small Kansas town. His father died when he was very young. His mother, in those days before Social Security, took in sewing to feed her family, to make ends meet. They lived on the upper story of a general store in that little town, really living from hand to mouth. She came home one day and told her family, you're going to have a new father. A truck pulled up to their apartment and loaded their meager possessions, and Wayne said they drove far out into the country, past thousands of acres, to a beautiful white farmhouse, and there waiting for him was, he said, his new father. He said, come on in, and welcomed him to a table with more food than Wayne said he had ever seen in his life. And yet, he said, I never felt quite at home. Time passed, and Wayne developed an acute appendicitis attack. It was in the middle of the night. They drove to the nearest doctor, and the doctor said they had to get him to a hospital for an emergency appendectomy, which was hours away. They drove, and finally, getting to the hospital, they wheeled him almost immediately into emergency surgery. And Wayne heard his stepfather say to the doctor, Doc, you've got to do everything you can for this boy. My whole farm is riding on him. Wayne said in that moment, he knew he wasn't adopted. He knew he was his father's true son. My friends, these can be lonely times for many of us, and many of us do have that pervading sense of estrangement and isolation from one another. But rest assured, you're not alone. There's someone who is beside us, whose presence is like a flickering ember deep within our hearts. It may not be seen. Its effects are sometimes unnoticed, but that is the presence of a guide, of a love, of a presence that will never leave us alone. My friends, we're not just adopted. We are truly God's own daughters and sons.